Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Art Snaps. Thank you very much for joining me for this podcast, which celebrates Swindon's important and fabulous collection of modern British art. I'm Katie and I work for Swindon Museum and Art Gallery as part of the Art on Tour project, which aims to share more of the art collection with more people and in more places. Whilst lockdown restrictions are preventing us from doing this work, these weekly Art Snaps aim to bring you information about the artworks from the collection. And today we're going to look at a subject matter in art called still life. And it's a genre that many of us are familiar with in some way, which became popular back in the late 16th and 17th centuries when artists began depicting arrangements of various domestic objects. And often back then these were infused with symbolic or religious meaning. And still life as a theme has stuck around ever since and has transformed over the years. In the 20th century, we saw a new and intense era of self-expression and experimentation in art, and the still life remained an important vehicle for expressing new ideas and exploring artistic processes. There are several great examples of still lifes in Swindon's collection which I could talk about today, such as Lawrence Gowing's Apples 2 from 1940. This is one of my personal favourites because even though it's small, at only 18 by 28 centimetres, it's incredibly rich, with that jewel-like green and those short, thick brushstrokes. In a quiet way, it's rather lovely, and even though the objects represented are quite limited, it's pretty much what one would expect from a still life in its careful study of an everyday object. The three paintings I'm going to talk about today do something a little different and unexpected with their still life arrangements, and serve to push the boundaries of this subject matter. The first is an earlier 20th century work by Edward Wordsworth, and the second two by John Lessore and Lisa Milroy were painted later on in the century, in the 80s, but show two very different styles and approaches. So first up is this wonderfully crisp and vibrant still life of marine objects by Edward Wadsworth, which is called Bright Intervals and was painted in 1928. Wordsworth was known for his association with a movement called Vorticism, which celebrated the speed and dynamism of all things modern in the early decades of the 1900s. But he's perhaps most famous for his dazzle camouflage designs for battleships during the First World War, which involved creating geometric patterns on ships to confuse the enemy's perception of their position and speed. As we can see, after the war he continued to paint nautical themes. Bright Intervals depicts an arrangement of objects associated with the sea, including a shell, a barometer, a blueprint, fishing floats, a joiner's square and binoculars, all encircled by a vibrant red ribbon. The slightly odd white shape to the right of the image is simply a block Wordsworth used regularly to build up his compositions. So here we can see he's used it to create a bit of height within the scene. And the whole piece is painted with incredible precision, which reflects his early training as an engineering draftsman. And it's also a result of his mastery of a medium called egg tempera, which involves binding pigment together with egg yolk. And this is traditionally associated with wall paintings called frescoes, but Wordsworth began using it in 1922 because he liked the clear primary colours he could achieve. But despite the striking clarity of the painting, there's something almost unreal about it, which at first glance is quite difficult to put your finger on. But in fact, when we begin to look more closely, we realise that certain things are a bit off, and perhaps our perception is being messed around with. Though the still life is carefully observed, there's an imaginary background which looks slightly odd, as if the sea and the boat are pushed right up to the wall or window ledge. Yet the scale is off, with the boat almost seeming too small in comparison to the still life. And look at the fishing floats. Amidst the care and control with which Wordsworth has arranged and depicted the objects, they almost seem as if they should have toppled off the table and the white block. And this creates a kind of tension in what is otherwise quite a still image. So it seems that even after his work with the dazzle camouflage was finished, Wordsworth was still very much playing with our perception of objects. And here he's used a still life to make us question what we see in very subtle ways. The next piece I want to show you is John Lassore's painting, Leon Kossoff with A Landscape Near Rieti, which is dated from around 1982 to 83. Of course, this is a talk about still life, and you could argue that what I'm showing you isn't a still life at all, because the figure is a key component of this piece. But I think the great thing about this is that it feels like a portrait and a still life in one, and it shows how an image of a person can be enriched by their surroundings. It depicts the artist Leon Kossoff, who was a valued member of the School of London Artists, who championed figurative art in the second half of the 20th century. He was also a good friend of John Lessore, who situated him in his, Lassore's, studio, surrounded by his paintings and all the equipment needed for painting and printmaking, including the edge of a printing press to the right-hand side. And this setting is just as carefully observed as the sitter, so there's a sense of it being just as important. And in fact, what it gives us is an interesting record of the work Lessore was doing at the time. The painting Landscape Near Rieti from 1962, which is indicated in the title, is the largest painting in the scene, and it's the one that's situated next to Kossoff. And in the lower left of the scene, there's a nude from 1978, which has since been destroyed. And just visible below the jars on the shelf is a painting called Lassalle. Incidentally, those different shaped jars and bottles on the shelf behind Kossoff make an interesting still life in themselves. And they really add to the sense that this is an active and working studio, of the kind that Kossoff was used to being in. We can also see that two paintings of Kossoff by Lessore are included amongst the artworks, including a half-length toward the top centre, which is now destroyed, and a painting of him facing left, which almost looks like a mirror image of the Swindon painting and is now in a private collection. And by including these paintings, Lessore enables us to see his sitter from three different angles. So essentially, by creating a painting of paintings around his sitter, he's enhanced the presence of Kossoff and shown us that at this time his friend and fellow artist was an important subject matter and perhaps even key to the development of his practice. Our final painting for today is Lisa Milroy's Small Objects from 1987. And though it was painted only 4 or 5 years after Lassore's piece, we can see that she has a very different style, which is quite minimalist in comparison, with its stark white background and seemingly random items arranged in a grid-like formation. And certainly it's a very different approach to a still life, which is driven by very different ideas. As Milroy has explained, they are, quote, a group of objects that might come together in the bottom of a drawer, for example, as odds and ends, things that are quite insignificant, but somehow intriguing for one or two details. The spiral twist on a screw, the pink tip of a coloured pencil crayon, the glass bubble of a torch bulb encapsulating the tiny world of a coiled metal filament, unquote. So Small Objects is all about giving us the opportunity to appreciate the qualities of each object and also their formal relationships to one another. And Milroy helps us do that with a structured approach to presenting them by placing them along lines which move horizontally and vertically across the painting. And the advantage of spacing them out like this on a white background is that we can recognise them quickly and easily as the individual objects that they are, and it also enables a comparison between them. In the end, Milroy wants us to remember the qualities of the objects rather than simply what they are. And this remembering reflects her approach to painting, as the items are actually painted from memory rather than observed from life. And it's the remembered idea of the object that's important to her, rather than the object itself. So to draw this episode to a conclusion, we've looked at 3 very different approaches to still life today. In Wadsworth painting, our perception has been teased and manipulated. And in Lassore's, we see how a still life can enhance a portrait and provide an historical document. And finally, in Milroy's painting, we're encouraged to appreciate the nuanced differences and similarities between objects that we wouldn't normally expect to see in a painting. That brings me to the end of today's Art Snap, and I sincerely hope you've enjoyed listening and hopefully learning a bit more about still life paintings in Swindon's art collection. If you want to hear more, all of our Art Snaps are available through Swindon Museum and Art Gallery's YouTube channel, and everything else Art on Tour has to offer is available through our blog at www.swindonmuseumandartgallery.org.uk/artontour. As always, do stay safe and stay well. Have a lovely day, and bye for now.